Sorry. What I started to say before was what we're doing today is we're going to take you through a bit of history that you probably are not familiar with. There have been many things written about Ma, and the fact is that they're bits and pieces or versions of the truth. This is really, this project is put together by myself and Dr. Chi, my colleague, and it contains things you've never heard or seen before. So I thought I'd mention that to you. Now, the way we're going to conduct this is Ken has pulled together a beautiful 5-minute video of perhaps Ma's greatest masterpiece called Nostalgia. So that's going to play, and then a slide will come up on the screen, which are some pictures of Ma, and Ken's going to talk a little about his father-in-law, because I don't know if I mentioned, Ken is literally the last living descendant of Ma. So if you wouldn't mind, start the video and enjoy it, and just feel the expression within that video as it goes. Ken, take it away.
Ken, you're on mute.
Hello.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
My father-in-law, Sicong, has been gone nearly 40 years. But he still lives vividly in my memory. His eloquence, his wealthy of language, and his uncommon humility. What impressed me most was his tranquil mind. He was a public figure, but he never tried to seek public spotlight. What is important to him was to create the most beautiful Chinese classical music in the world. I believe millions of his fans agree. He accomplished this. He loved Chinese folk music and folk songs. He admired them, so pure, natural, original, and unpretending. They pass from one generation to the next one and accumulated many generations' wisdoms and harmonies. They inspired him to consider them as his creation's lifeline. He melted them into classical music structures and created a unique Chinese flavor classical music. He used violin and piano, sometimes whole symphony orchestra, to express their beauties and to speaking their musical languages. My father-in-law was not only an outstanding composer, an accomplished violinist, but he was also a dedicated educator. He created first music school. First, all Chinese member orchestra in Guangdong. He also built Central Conservatory of Music in Beijing from ground up as its first president. The school today is the most prestigious music university in China. The school has trained many young musical talents. They play important roles in today's world's musical stages. Central Conservatory Music is still using. He established teaching methods to train young talents. To us, he was simply a kind, gentle, loving, and unselfish father and grandfather. We are grateful to have them in our life. There are many books written about him in Chinese. Chinese musical scholars has formed a Ma Sicong research committee to study and analyzing his works. They get together from time to time to share their findings and to publish their results. I always wish there is a book written about him in English. Until I met Matt. After reading his book, Cross-Eye White Lily, Amazon's #1 bestseller, the story of a Russian fighter pilot during World War II against Nazi. The world's first female fighter pilot, a pioneer in women's rights, Lilia Lityak. I was so impressed by this book. It was not only a great war drama, it is a beautiful, sentimental love story. As a matter of fact, I have translated this book into Chinese. Hopefully, I can introduce this unique hearing to Chinese readers. So I asked Matt whether he was willing to co-write my father-in-law's autobiography with me. I am grateful. He agreed. So the result is this book, The King of Violins. Now, I'm going to pass him over to Matt. He's going to talk about the book. Matt, it's yours.
Great, thank you, Ken. I would have to say to all of you that this was probably the most unique project I was ever involved in. I have no Chinese background, and so Ken was kind enough to beat my brains out and teach me about Chinese history. Now, the reason it's important is because this presentation is not a presentation about music. This is about the bittersweet life of an absolutely wonderful man. And as we went through it, what I realized was something very important. Somehow Ken had transferred Ma's feelings to me, and in reading his diaries and memories. And so what the book does and what I'm going to do in this presentation is it's done in the first person. So this is my attempt to let Ma talk to you directly about his life. Now, the other thing I want to mention to you is that, you know, John Donne said in 1624, no man is an island entirely to itself. And so too it is with Ma, that there were many influences, many things happened in his life that reflect his music, probably more so than Tchaikovsky, Brahms, you know, even Mozart. And so you'll get a flavor of that as we go. And I'm gonna go fairly quickly. And obviously there are a number of things in the book that are not going to be in here. We just sort of decided to stay relevant. So Mu, if you could put up the first slide, and we'll start right now. Can you full screen the first slide?
Can you see my screen?
No, but if it's up, we'll go. Okay, here. We had it for a moment. Well, so I'm going to move along with Plan B. Okay, there you go. Thank you. Got it. All right, so if you go back, if you just go back to the first title slide for a second. Yeah, what I want to explain to everyone real quickly is that there are many, many aspects of Ma's life that we could talk about. What we decided to concentrate the book around is not only his music and how it came to be, but the most bittersweet element of his life. And that is China wound up taking the most celebrated musical treasure and made him an enemy of the state. And so it's a very poignant story. So now we'll move on to the slides themselves. Now, keep going. Yeah, okay. So the other thing I want to mention to you is, since I'm not Chinese, and many of the readers, and we've gotten some wonderful reviews so far, are not Chinese either, that what I've done is phonetically pronounce the key Chinese names as best I can. And so that's what the little parens is all about. It's in both the book and it's in this presentation, because the plan is this presentation will see itself around the world. Anyway, Ma's mother's name was Huan Chulian, and she was born in 1893. She was a peasant. She was the mother of 10 children, and her role in the family was very distinct. She was kind of like the family fixer, the handy person. If the plumbing went out, she took care of it. She also kept a close watch, and she was the manager of the budget. And so on, I'll just click, and you can just move to the next slide. So, in fact, Mother was my first role model. She had a kind heart, a smart mind, and an amazingly forgiving attitude. And she used to treat us to understanding morality and values through storytelling. One of her favorites was Mulan, and she believed very firmly in study and hard work, and she still had a great sense of humor, and she sang and performed in local operas. One of the things she taught us, move to the next slide, is that she had a great belief in Confucian morality. And three things I remember most as a young man are, she told me, people were good at birth, but they learn habits that create differences, and that's why people become what they are. And she always preached respect for elders, and that it was very important to follow rules. Next slide. Now, my father's name was Ma Yuhang, and he was also born in 1893 in Haiphong, which today most people know as Guangzhou. And he was an imperial scholar. He was a very smart man. He was also entrepreneurial and very engaging. And by that, I mean, one of the ways he earned money as a young man was other scholars that were taking the exam, he would sit outside the window, they would pass him the questions, he would pass the answers back, and for that he would earn a little fee. So whether it was moral or not, it was a wonderful way of earning a few dollars. Now, unlike my mother, he was very intimidating. And so while I had a great respect for him, he scared the hell out of me. And the other thing about it is, while I never became interested really in politics, he was unbelievably politically involved from the first day I remember. Next slide. Now, everybody, most people think of the Sing dynasty, and they talk about ceramics and beautiful whatever, but this was not what my father was all about. He really was committed to the end of Sing rule, because number one, they continued to position themselves as intellectually superior. Don't know where my slide went. Intellectually superior. Where did we go? Okay, so anyway, he rejected their intellectual superiority argument and their 90-10 dominance of the Chinese Han population. And he also rejected the philosophy of, if we keep China carved up like a melon, we'll remain in power. He believed in a united Republic of China and a unified Republic of China. That is what he wanted to do. And so, next slide. My father's best friend, and it's important just to be aware of this, was Chen Jiangming. And he was a little older than me. He became commander of Sun Yat-sen's Revolutionary Alliance for Democracy. And the organization believed in political order first and then democratic rights. Myself and Cheng felt a little differently. We felt that we wanted both now, and that there should be a united public that is self-governed and, and formed by integrated provinces. Next slide. Now, as for me, while all this is going on, music was inevitably a part of my life. I played the organ at 7. I played the Chinese string instrument called the yukin at 9. And my brother Siqui, one of my older brothers, had a terrible bike accident in Paris, and it didn't heal in Paris, and he had to come home. And that was when I first heard the violin, because Siqui had taken up playing the violin to pass the time in Paris. So that was literally the first time I heard a violin, perhaps even the first time anybody in China heard a violin. Anyway, as time went on, I quickly realized that the violin was going to be my life passion. Next slide. The other thing about me as a kid was I was headstrong and practical. 2 stories that happened in my life that I still remember. I was easily bored and stubborn. And so one example of that was I used to, on my way to school, go swimming. And I did that because I wasn't particularly interested in the teacher. She was kind of boring and she never smiled. And so one day my mother caught up with my truancy and asked me what happened. And I explained to her, and she took me back to school and talked to the teacher. And she told the teacher I wouldn't do that again. And she also told the teacher to smile. It wouldn't hurt. The other thing was, despite my stubbornness, I was also pragmatic and logical. And the best way of discussing that real quickly is the story of the gentleman and the beggar. My mother told me one day we looked out the window and she said, "Look at the fine gentleman on a horse. And over there is the beggar." She said, "Do you know the difference?" And I nodded my head, and she said, "One is willing to work hard for a living and the other one is not." And I never forgot that. Next slide. Well, so when Siqui went back to Paris, I went with him at 11 to study the violin. My mother and father were skeptical, but they let me go. They could see the passion in my eyes. We lived in East Paris, and my first lessons were on an old violin by a teacher that was also the landlord. And she taught me a couple of important things, simple at this early stage. The left hand made the notes, the right hand created harmony, and the shoulder placement offered me infinite variety. And so with that as background and lots of practice, believe it or not, about a year later, I wrote my first musical composition. I was taught by a graduate of the Conservatory of Paris, and I composed a piece called The Saddened Moon. And it was based on a familiar anti-Sing hero called Si Not You. And it was during this time, the civil wars started to wane in China. But my father, as a result of what went on, became jobless. And so when Siqui returned, he decided he had to come back home, and I remained in Paris. And so I next wound up moving to the city of Nancy, which was, I think, 40 to 50 miles outside of Paris, maybe a little further. And I studied at the Conservatory Nancy, a very historical sort of Baroque place, very beautiful. And at 15, I remember I was the youngest in class. And believe it or not, I encountered what for me was my first bigotry. People told me I had Chinese ears. And I had to think about bigotry for the first time I had seen violence, I had seen animosity, but bigotry was different. And when we had the final exams, I actually played Paganini's Violin Concerto number 1, and I lost. I came in second. And I vowed to myself I would never come in second again. And so, next slide. And so I vowed I was going to become technically proficient. And I was fortunate enough to make a connection. And the violin master from the opera, National de Paris, Paul Oberndorfer, became my teacher. And that opera is so famous. There's a picture of Degas. Degas, memorialized it in one of his paintings, and over on the left is the museum, the opera place itself. Now, what he taught me very quickly was that my musical expression was excellent, but I made many technical errors. And I also quickly realized, once again, I was the first Asian to attend a rather prestigious but conservative place. And next slide. So here I am, and what happens is my training takes an unexpected turn. One of the first setbacks in my life happens. I have a cyst on my neck, and it's pressing on my nerves, and I'm unable to play. So my brother and I moved to the surfside community of Brecht, which I had never seen anything like it in China, with beaches and waves. And the air, it did shrink my cyst over the next 6 months. Now, during that time, I explored piano masters. Since I had so much free time, I learned about multi-part harmony, which very simply is the melody dominates, accompanied by simple chords. And the other thing I started to learn, I had always believed in the beauty of nature, but I started to even see the raw, calm beauty of winter in composition. So it started that was a very important stop in my life, and it was very interesting. So next slide. So it's now my cyst is gone, and I'm ready to move back. I go back to Paris, and Siqui decides that he must go back now because things even turned worse. And my other brother was with us, and that is Siwu. You see the picture of them. But Siqui decided that he had to go back, and he was going to start an embroidery arts business, and sell the product back in Europe. And he asked the two of us to return, because in my case, I had now become quite fluent in French. Unfortunately, Siwu had fallen in love with sort of a French debutante, and he refused. He wanted to stay there. Next slide. Well, I thought about it a lot, and reluctantly, I refused Siqui's request. But one of the things that happened before he left is he overheard me practicing my favorite piece at the time, Schubert's Serenade, which actually will enter into my life again later, as you'll find out. And he heard the beauty coming from my violin, and he nodded and said, "You know what, brother, you should remain in Paris for your violin studies." And so I did. Next slide. Again, with some good fortune and coming back, I made contact with Jules Boucheret, who was again one of the great teachers in Paris at the time. And he actually said, after watching the way I performed, ultimately, that he thought my compositions would endure. And he showed me things in a very untraditional way. He took me to the museum and showed me Rembrandt's cow and said, "Do you see simplicity as beauty?" And he showed me how Beethoven transformed simple chords into passionate art. And then he made a comment about my own work at that time. He said, "Ma, you have the beauty of Byron and the frenzy of Nietzsche." And so things I thought about and never forgot the rest of my life. Next slide. Well, The training had to stop at that point, and it was time to return home to help my parents. So I got on a ocean liner that went to Marseille. It was very famous in those years, called the André Lebron. And not having a wealth of money, what I did was I did onboard concerts in exchange for food and lodging. And when I arrived in Shanghai, I saw how the city had been scarred by the Chiang Kal-shek purges. But on the positive side, when I came home, there was my mother's arms and using my nickname, my eye, and that made me feel good. Unfortunately, I looked at my father and he had aged tremendously and he was fragile. But also, on the other positive side, Siqui had transformed himself into a profit-seeking merchant and had built a very successful business. So next slide. So sometime later, I returned to Paris with 2 stacks of money. Siqui gave me 2 stacks and he said, 1 stack is for you. Study with the best teachers. Continue to build your craft. And he said, with the 2nd stack, give it to Siwu and tell him to marry Suji, which was his new latest love, and bring her back to China. So Siwu almost did that. He decided to move back with Suji to Shanghai. And there he taught French at a Shanghai foreign college. And you're going to find it was a terrible move. It started out well, but didn't end well. Now back in Paris, next slide, I now received again a wonderful study by a Turkish composer by the name of Jacob Binnenbaum. And he taught me how to be a great composer. And again, using many of the classic artists of the time and musicians to give me, cues about developing my craft. But what he said at the end is something, again, I never forgot. Learn from many, but do as you believe. And that was a philosophy I carried with me through the rest of my life. Next slide. The other thing, it was now time, I realized, to connect my compositions to real life. I was not about writing compositions for the sake of the beauty of music, as so many are. And so at the still waters of Lake Zanlu, I wrote a piano trio. I encapsulated the aromas of grasses and birds wobbling, flowers and birds wobbling in my violin sonata number 1. And I started to have concerts, and they were sold out everywhere. Now, what you see up in the upper right-hand side is an actual cover from one of the concerts. The only thing that's been done is where the picture of me was, which was a little tattered and torn. The creator of this presentation has dropped in the real picture of me at that age in that concert. Now, what happened was the ruling party, the Kuomintang, I started to catch the attention of them. And they said, we would like you to become a member of the government's music committee. The fact was, they wanted me to become a member of the government, but I agreed to do the music committee appointment, even though I knew there was some propaganda involved in it. So what then happened is, not long after all that, at 21, I met the love of my life, Muli. And I was introduced to her because I was teaching, and a student by the name of Wan Hen said, I have this sister, Muli, who you should meet. And the first time I met her, I knew she was different. She was European in style, and heels, clothing, red lipstick, although she was just average from a musical standpoint. She was also ahead of her time. She was passionate and stubborn about women's role in society. Ultimately, she would handle my private life, my career, and my compositions. And here's a little piece of information you should know. All the things that have been published say we married. We actually lived together the rest of our lives in love and had a wonderful partnership, but I never believed that piece of paper was important. to actually have a marriage certificate. So now, what started to happen, of course, was the Chinese ran into trouble with the Japanese, which were never really their friends. And so it caused my music to take another unforeseen direction. So in the 30s, there was a sort of a calm truce between the communists, the National Party, and China. But at the same time, Japan had a very specific goal. They wanted to avoid a powerful united China. And so ultimately a full-scale war, as most of you know, broke out. And so to boost soldier and citizen morale, I started to write war songs. The first piece was called China's Soldier. Not going to play it here now. It was a song of unity, and I wrote many, many more. And so my intense loyalty to my homeland grew enormously during that period. Now, ironically, next slide, during these difficult times, I wrote what probably is one of the most beautiful pieces of music I have ever written. And the world now considers it my masterpiece. And my intention was to eulogize the bravery and industriousness of the Chinese people. And it has, arguably become the most famous Chinese composition, classic composition in Chinese history. Ken, I'm going to play about 90 seconds of a beautiful version of this that was done with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. But I'm going to let Ken talk about it first, and then we'll play it, if that's okay with you, Ken. Could we get Ken's voice up?
Ken, you are on mute. Unmute.
Okay.
Oh, Ken,
Right.
take it away.
Okay. I'm not a musician, so I'm going to read what I write down for preparation of this presentation. I hope it's okay. Nostalgia is the second movement of an Inner Mongolia suite. My father-in-law adopted this folk song from the Great Bank area of Yellow River. A traveler with a camel caravan on Silk Road is leaving the country. His heart is heavy with homesickness. He is leaving his hometown behind. Sadness overwhelms him. Emotion causes his lips to quiver. So this is sad and haunting piece. This piece is also called Longing for Home. I'm done.
Okay, can you play, Moo, can you play about 60 seconds of it? And again, just feel the feeling as this young man plays. Moo, thank you. Needless to say, because of time, it's a piece that you'd love to hear the entirety of, but there's not time for it. The other thing I thought we'd mention here is Edward mentioned yesterday when we were talking that Ma lived before YouTube. So the idea of his beautiful music and him playing his beautiful music is a workaround that we had to do for this presentation. Now, Let's go to the next slide, okay? So here we were in the middle of all this turmoil. I created this beautiful piece, and then we had our first child. Her name was Ma Bishui, and my first daughter. And so I wanted to take her to meet my father, who at the time was living in Shanghai. And a terrible thing happened. When we got there, I realized my father was deeply involved in the politics of the struggle. And what happened was, when we got there, I discovered he had been shot in the back of the head, and he died at 56. And there were no signs of a struggle. And the police and everybody else, nobody ever really wanted to solve the problem. So that is the New Asia Hotel where it happened. That's the street where the place was. Next slide. So my father's dead, my first son, there's turmoil going on. The Japanese continue to, to push forward through Southeast Asia. Over there, you'll see they even had the bicycle patrol. They were just determined to, to rip through as much as they could. So we decided to return to Haiphong. I figured that it was a quiet place, would probably not be a target of the Japanese. And there I was reunited with my mother and my brother. And we did some performances, but there was limited ability there. And so I soon became restless with that. And so we learned that Violin in the South was known much more for support of the arts and culture. And we were, we were told it was a good place for me to continue. So the next slide. So we moved to Guilin. Now, this is another thing that I'm not proud of, but is a reality of my life. When I returned to Sun Yat-sen University in '92, the school made known that we were looking for a recital piano accompanist. And again, a self-confident European-style woman applied. I'm not going to mention her name. And a professional chemistry was apparent right off the bat, but it did lead to a 3-month personal indiscretion. And while I thought I kept it quiet, I knew one day that Muli knew when she was pouring tea, and she said, "How does she like her tea?" And I had nothing I could really say at that point. Next slide. So needless to say, regaining Muli's trust was not easy. She tended to watch my behavior like a hawk on and off the stage. And our second child, Celia, was born, who was Ken's wife, actually. And at that point, we were living in Vichy, and it was kind of a haven for nature, songbirds, azaleas, and the beauty. I communed with nature, and there I composed Violin Concerto in F major, and it basically captured my faith and hope for coming good times, that all this madness would end. And but once again, Muli reminded me that she hadn't forgotten. Celia's cat master got ill, and we managed to bring her back from the depths of almost passing away. And we all applauded that master was back. But Muli then looked at me and said, if only all unpleasant things could be removed that easily. And so I never strayed again after that. And so next slide. Finally, the madness ended, and it was time. The war was over, and the family decided to celebrate in sort of a re-energized Shanghai at that time. And everybody was there. Siqui, Su, my Zhu Suli, other brothers and sisters, and many were now accomplished in music or other kinds of career. We had a tearful moment of reflection for my father. And I still remember that Siwu mentioned that maybe one day a museum would be filled with my works. Now, interestingly, again, it's just how life works. I composed the pastoral song, which you'll hear a little bit of later, which is probably one of the most beautiful pieces of music I ever created. Next slide. Well, as most of you know, the Civil War ended, and to the surprise of many, and in some cases, the surprise of nobody, Ma Zedong came to power. And so, in the beginning, like many dictators, he imposed strict order, stamped out corruption, took hold of inflation. But at the same time, a new state constitution came along, and the social democracy phase of United Chinese Republic was gone. And interestingly, he named French-educated Zhou Enlai as his premier, and we moved at that time to Qiten, which is about 70 miles from Beijing, and established the Central Conservatory of Music. And now I was becoming extremely well known and well recognized, well thought of, awarded. And so Zhao wanted to make sure that I was treated properly, and he raised my salary almost to the equivalent of Chairman Mao, which would become a bit of a problem later, as you'll see. Well, one of the things, just as a byproduct you should be aware of, again, because of all the turmoil between the United States and Taiwan now, at that time, Mao had many, many other important things to deal with. And so he had little interest in the fact that Chiang Kal-shek retreated to Taiwan. And so he ignored it as basically too small. And he was focused on the absolute rule in the mainland and installation of his philosophies. And so over in Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek created a one-party state, and he did befriend the United States. And as many of you know, Taiwan then experienced the economic miracle, and it's had industrial and economic growth since that time. Now, next slide. So by the 1950s, it was important to me to celebrate the common man and please President Zhao in my music. So one day I took the conservatory teachers to tame the Wai River flooding. And it actually became the motivation behind my Wai River Cantina. And so I was pleased to celebrate the common man in my music. That also then brought up, as Zhao started to see what I could do, he requested I do a stage play to celebrate the 230th anniversary of the poet Pu Yan'an. And what happened, which was kind of surprising, because at that point I figured I knew everything there was to know about music, but Zhao listened to some of the music and said, I think it needs a lighter tone. Well, it turned out I revised it. He was right, and we did that. And somewhere along the way, I then wrote another piece, which is one of my favorites, called The Song of the Mountain Forest. We're going to play about 60 seconds of that for you here too, but Ken's going to speak a little about it because it's a remarkable work. Ken, over to you. You're muted, Ken. There you go.
A friend of my father-in-law sing a folk song from his hometown in Yunnan province, near Lu River, wishing my father-in-law could use it. So he played several times, finding it was beautiful and refreshing. So when he walked on the song of a mountain forest, he decided to incorporate this folk song, this folk music. In the meantime, he also recalled his favorite French impressionist, Paul Gauguin, suspended the call. So the first movement of the symphony is the call. Instead of a young lady raise her hand, calling in Gauguin's painting, my father-in-law created a mountain spirit called elf. Imagine at the daybreak in a primeval forest, at the shadow of a mountain valley, the mountain spray elf is calling. The sound is floating through the crystal clear air. It is a mysterious and haunting piece. There are 4 additional movements: cross mountains, love song, dancing, and the lights. So the last movement, the light is coming. Mountain spray elf, elf's calls reappeared. The function of the last 4 movements is to add colorfulness, illusion, and poetic nature to the entire symphony.
Who played 60 seconds or so. You'll feel the almost mystical nature. So at this point, next slide. So at this point, I'm literally at some of the most productive point in my life. And I'm traveling the world as China's unofficial music ambassador. I'm selling hundreds of thousands of albums, but my blending of Western elements into Eastern music and my high salary did start to disturb Mao. And Mao would preach that music had to be loved by the masters. And subtle criticism started to show up that Mao's music is full of dreaming and sweetness. Communism is the spirit of proletariat selfishness, was written. Now, despite these growing differences, Chairman Mao still called me China's national treasure. And this is how my life became an up and down struggle. So what happened, next slide. My first daughter, Bishui, was educated, was living in Shanghai at the time. You see the picture of her up on the right side. My younger daughter is below her. And excuse me, my wife is below her, or I should say Ken's wife is below her. But Bishui caught the Kool-Aid. She was a total supporter of the anti-right movement, and all she did was challenge me. Why inject bourgeois West traditions into our Eastern music? Why was grandfather a revolutionary? Why didn't Chiang Kal-shek believe all patients deserve a better life? Eventually, our tensions became such that we cut off all communications. In fact, Another way of putting it nicely is I lost my first daughter. Now, the other thing, next slide, even worse, perhaps, was I seriously misjudged the impact of the Cultural Revolution on China and on my own life. So initially, to avoid conflict, I wrote a Tetsugao called My Determination. I didn't believe it, but I wrote it. Before long, angry teenagers were forcing me to apologize for my music sadness. Students I had taught. And one day I was asked to report to the Music Academy. And I went to get in my car and the chauffeur said, "Take the bus. The revolution is underway." By the time I arrived at the auditorium, hundreds of angry teenagers were verbally and physically abusing me. And so things went from bad to worse. Along with 50 other educators, I was forced to spend 50 days at the Social Institute for Study Training. And, Tetsugaos were written for me. The first Red Guards were formed. And even the then president, Un Chape, who was third in command, seemed to have misgivings. But he was quietly taken care of. In 1969, he died of a mysterious illness, and it took 3 years before his family was informed that he had gone missing. And his assumption was he was murdered some way. Now, and things got even worse as the inhumane acts intensified. They put dunce caps on my head, and they labeled me a cow demon. They spit on me, and they whipped me with sticks. And my friend, wonderful musician by the name of Lo Si-pin, who was a Clyburn runner-up, had his wrist slashed. He could never play again. Children made me crawl on my hands and knees. 2 Red Guards, no more than 14, whipped me with belts. And as it would turn out, my hands would never be the same again. Next slide. So I'm not going to get into the details. Through a long and arduous, complicated escape route, myself and my family got out of China, and we escaped with the help of a supportive boat captain who I've never revealed the name of, and made it to the safety of Hong Kong. And along the way, that captain negotiated through a bunch of checkpoints with sort of politically unreliable people. And I remember vividly, we traveled choppy seas guided by the lights of Hong Kong. And when we arrived at that rock promenade, I took off my badge, a static, and threw it in the water with a vengeance. Well, next slide. I mentioned earlier that my one of my older brothers had moved to Shanghai, and he was teaching at the French school there, as you remember, with his beautiful wife. Well, things did not end so well for Siwu either. The school became labeled as a ground for self-indulgent European thinking. He was interrogated about my escape. He was dragged to an open window, and depending on the stories and reports, his body sailed 14 floors to his death. And it was listed as a suicide. And I know that wasn't true.
Hi, Matt. I'm terribly sorry. We have about 5 more minutes before we have to move on. Thank you so much.
Okay. So anyway, what happened is we got to Hong Kong. We then went, just move the slides. We then went to, we were moved to the United States by the American Secret Service, and I was imprisoned. The secret police gave me a file. I was called special case that I had betrayed the country, and we wound up holding a press conference in New York. Life magazine published a story, and the story was burned at the Tiananmen Square. So life went on, and I'm just going to skip, move. What we're going to do is I'm just going to go to slide 53. Okay. And despite all this turmoil and all this craziness, when Kissinger made a secret trip to China in 71. He said, he told Kissinger it was all a terrible mistake, referring to me. And unfortunately it was, and they attempted to make amends. They sent over the Minister of Culture, provide me with an invitation. And, you know, unfortunately, the way I looked at things was, I said, you know, there were, you know, I had this unimaginable escape. I had this press conference, the magazines, my ties to Taiwan. And so I just decided it was too risky and politely refused. And so sometime later, Leader Deng also sent somebody over and tried to get me to come back, and said, life has been forgiven. There's a 6,000-page reconciliation report. And so, you know, I again refused. So what happened at the end is I'm now in America, and I'm on slide 56, Moo. At the end, my daughter, Cecilia, so the picture on the right, insisted we collaborate on Libya as an opera. And so we did write the opera. It wasn't quite finished when we took off for Europe. And on return, I started to have some shortness of breath, and the work was not quite finished. So I continued to work on it. But it turned out that my health had deteriorated. During the time the cultural minister approved the production in Taipei. So I had 2 heart valves replaced. The procedure was said was going to be 95% successful. I played Schubert the night before the surgery and my serenade song. I even polished the script during the pre-op tests, but I died on the table. And what I've done here at the end, everybody, is just, I've had 2 friends that have had out-of-body experience that died and come back to life. And so I imagine this is what happened on the operating table. That Mao started to walk towards a bright yellow light as he passed through a forest. And there were dewdrops and serene forests and granite peaks. And he came upon a violin that sat at the base of a 1,000-year-old pine tree. And he played the song you heard before, Song of the Mountain Forest, and he felt 18 again. And when it's finished, he returned the violin to the tree, and then the dark silence of night filled the air. So fortunately, even though his life ended the way it did, and all the things that happened along the way, eventually he did get returned to his homeland. And today, some of you know, in Ganzhou, there's monuments, the walls where Ken's in front of, his 2 daughters are at the Memorial Hall, and Ma has been eulogized on stamps and envelopes and so on. And Moo, I'm going to go to 61, which is, I think it's, what you should know is that if Ma probably had one thing to say at the end, he would probably say, let the record show I did it my way. You tell me, Elizabeth, if there's another minute or so to play Pastoral, piece from Pastoral or not. It's okay, whatever you would decide. Well, hearing nothing, I'm going to play 60 seconds of what I believe is probably the most beautiful thing he ever wrote. And if there's a minute, Ken will say something. It's called Pastoral, which was done in 1944. Just play in 60 seconds. Moo. That's good. And
Thank you both so much for this wonderful presentation. Believe it or not,